Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Catherine. I am an AmeriCorps service member with the Vermont Land Trust. My role is education and outreach coordination, which was supposed to look a lot like school programming, and now it's a lot online programming. So we're doing the best that we can. Today we have a tree ID webinar that is family focused, and we have Ethan Tapper here. He is a Chittenden County Forester, and it's very exciting. This is my first online live webinar, so be patient with me because I'm going to be managing the Q&A, and then I'll pass it off to Ethan to do the content. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. You should see it at the bottom of the window here, and we'll save time for questions at the end. So I think that's everything.
Great. So my name's Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. County foresters are these foresters who work for the state Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And we do all kinds of different stuff, mostly focused on helping Vermont landowners figure out how to manage their land in a responsible way. And during this time, I'm trying to do all kinds of ways to reach out to you and give you more information about the woods and how to take care of it. And so with that, I'm going to start this presentation. Like Catherine said, there will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. And if you have questions, just pop them in the chat box. You can see the bar at the bottom of your screen. There'll be a chat icon. Click on that and put them in there, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. And so here we go. So we're calling this course Tree Identification for Beginner Naturalists. And so basically this is an idea, it's a simplified version of the tree identification course that I would normally do, which would be much more complicated, targeted at people who are just getting started and kids. And so I normally call this course Identifying Common Trees in Vermont. And I really want to stress here that partnering with the Vermont Land Trust, which I'm really excited about, we partner together on all different kinds of things with Catherine and Angie. And so the idea isn't to give you all the information about all the trees in Vermont, but just some common ones to help you when you're going through the woods. And so one of the amazing things about learning to identify trees is most people, when they walk out in the woods, they just see like trees, right? And then you start to learn what they are, and you go, oh, these trees are all different species, and they all sort of behave in different ways, and they all look different and sort of have a different character. Now, there's about 50 native species of Vermont, of trees in Vermont, but the top 10 most common species, which are listed here on this screen, account for almost all of them. So if you're out there in the woods with your tree ID book and there's a gajillion different species of trees in that book, you don't need to learn all of those. I would focus on these 10, and you'll have like almost all of the tree species in Vermont. And so the other thing I want to think about is you don't need to know also every single characteristic about these trees. What you can do is just learn these like big important characteristics. And what that will do is help you identify them. And then as you get more familiar with the tree species, then you can learn more about them and learn all of the different sort of nuances of like their personality and how to identify them. So white or paper birch, it's either called white birch or paper birch, it's the same tree, is a really good example of this. So there's all these different characteristics. They have leaves, and they have twigs, and they have buds, and they have flowers, and all these other different things. But most people can identify white paper birch just from the bark. So paper birch or white birch, and I'll use those interchangeably, it has white peely bark. It peels in these big sheets. You guys have probably all seen this. Peels in these big sheets. It's called paper birch because those bark sheets are like big sheets of paper. If you've walked through the woods in Vermont, you've probably seen this. It's striking because it's the only tree that's really white, and it's the only tree with these big sheets of bark that are peeling off it. So really all you need to identify paper birch is the bark. The bark is also really good for starting fires. If you guys have ever started campfires, it makes an amazing, amazing fire starter. And it's waterproof. So native people used to use it for all different kinds of things, including making birch bark canoes out of. So white or paper birch, focus on that white peely bark and you'll get there. So the cousin of paper birch is yellow birch. Yellow birch has a lot of the similar characteristics. So basically you can just focus on the bark, just like white birch, except for the bark, instead of being white and peeling in these big broad sheets, is like metallic and golden and peeling in these thin little papery sheets. It's really shiny. I should mention both yellow birch and white birch have these like horizontal dashes on their bark. They're called lenticels, but you don't need to know that. You just need to know that they look like these horizontal dashes. So they both have that, but you can tell between them because yellow birch bark will be golden and metallic, white birch bark will be white, yellow birch bark will be peeling in these thin little strips, paper birch or white birch bark will be peeling in those big papery sheets. There's also another interesting thing. That's what yellow birch looks like when it's young. A couple other interesting things about yellow birch. If you scratch the twigs, like if you get a twig and just scratch the bark with your thumb and smell it, it will smell like mint, like wintergreen. And so sometimes if you just have a twig and you don't know what it is, and maybe it's a young one, if you scratch and sniff and it smells like mint, it's yellow birch. The other thing that I say about yellow birch is that it grows legs and it does dance moves. So this picture on the screen is an example of that. And actually what that is that yellow birch is really good at growing on rotten wood. So let's say a tree falls over in the forest or a tree's cut and there's a stump. A yellow birch seedling will start growing on that stump and it will put roots down around that stump, and then the stump will rot away, and so it'll leave, those roots will be exposed and it'll leave it looking like it has legs. Now this is a tree species that you've probably all heard of a lot, but it's identifying it in the woods is a little bit harder. Sugar maple. So the bark of sugar maple, so we've been focusing on these peely barks. The bark of sugar maple is more sort of craggy and rough. And even when they're a young tree, it'll look warty. And so it'll have these just little like pock marks. If you run your hand up and down it, it'll just feel rough and like there's like warts on the bark. And then when it gets older and the bark gets older, it'll become more what I would call platy. So having these big, broad plates of bark. Sometimes the bark will also have this whitewashed appearance. So if you see the picture on the screen there, you'll see that there's like a big splash of white down the side of the tree. And sometimes when you're looking through the woods, you can start to pick out sugar maples just based on that whitewash, that sort of splash of white paint appearance on their bark. One thing that's really important to know about sugar maple is that the bark, while it will break up into these and be broken up into these sort of vertical plates when it's older, it'll never be shaggy or peely. So you shouldn't ever be able to like pop a piece of the bark off with your thumb. In telling sugar maple from its cousin red maple, that's a big difference because red maple has very thin bark and can be very shaggy and peely, and you can easily just sort of rub your hands up and down the tree and pop pieces of bark off. And with sugar maple, you should never be able to do that. So they have these sort of iconic leaf shapes. So you guys have probably all seen the shape of this leaf on all kinds of maple syrup containers and all kinds of Vermont products and stuff like this. Sugar maple has what's called a palmate leaf. And you can remember that because it's like the palm on your hand. And all that means is that there's a central point, which is right here in the center of the leaf. And from that, the veins of the leaf, these lines coming out from that center point, go off in a bunch of different directions. So it's like the fingers coming off from the center of the palm of your hand. And sugar maple has 5 major points on that leaf. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can also see that this area right here, this is called a sinus. It's the area between these 2 big lobes. The sinus of sugar maple is shaped like a U. And that's like the U in the word sugar. The other thing that you can identify sugar maple from is that a lot of times in our woods, you'll see these big, huge, open-grown trees. And when I say open-grown, what I mean is that when a tree normally grows in the woods, what they'll do is they'll put most of their energy into growing upwards, and because they're competing with their neighbors for light, reaching for the sunlight, and so most of the branches will be up in the top of the tree pointing upwards. Now, in the case of in case of trees that are grown in the open, those branches will spread out and stretch out like this, stretching out sort of horizontally because there's no other trees that are competing with them. Many sugar maple trees, when Vermont was mostly cleared for agriculture in the 1800s, sometimes they left these sugar maple trees in the field. So they would be trees that would be for shade for livestock like sheep and cows. And then also they would sugar them in the springtime. And so there's these huge old trees that are now scattered around our forest. The forest has regrown around them from those former pastures, and they're really striking. They just look like these amazing ancient trees growing in a way that's unusual to all the other trees in the forest. And so here are some pictures of what that can look like. So you probably have recognized trees that look like this in the woods. And when trees are growing like this in your woods, they're usually sugar maple. Another tree species that is really, really common in Vermont is white ash. So white ash, the best characteristic for telling white ash is its bark. And so a lot of these other barks, remember, so we have the birches where their bark is peeling into these horizontal strips or sheets. Sugar maple, where the bark is warty and rough, or breaking up maybe into these sort of vertical plates and maybe having that whitewashed appearance. White ash bark is it's like looking at a pattern on a rug or something like that. It's this very symmetrical, regular pattern of these very thin bark ridges, which sort of seem to like make this interlocking diamond shape appearance. It's very, very regular, and it just sort of has this sort of snake skin or interlocking diamond appearance, and the bark will be symmetrical all the way around the tree. And so with many of these other trees, the way that the tree sort of breaks up and becomes shaggy or becomes rough or becomes peely or platy will be sort of irregular, and it'll look different on one side of the tree than on the other side of the tree. With ash, it'll be the same all the way around the tree. Right now, you're not going to have access to buds. So a bud is just what the trees carry in the wintertime, which becomes their leaves and their flowers and their twigs later in the year. But for most of the year, when we don't have leaves, we have these buds. And this bud at the very end of this twig is called a terminal bud. And that's just on the end of every twig, a tree species will carry a terminal bud that often looks different than these buds on the side, which we call lateral buds. The terminal bud, if you have an ash twig, the terminal bud looks like a chocolate chip. If you see that, it's this brown chocolate chip shaped thing on the end of every twig. I also often say that ash trees have fat fingers. And all that means is that their twigs are a lot thicker than the twigs of all the other trees. So if you look up, especially when there's no leaves, you look up into the canopy, you'll see all these other tree species will have these very fine, intricate networks of twigs, and ash will just sort of have these clumsy looking fat ones. In the summertime with their leaves, they have lots of these little leaflets. And that to me looks like bamboo leaves. It's like a jungly kind of appearance when you look up into the canopy of the ash tree, which is just lots of little leaves. And here's an example of those sort of fat fingers. So you can see that to the right here, we have, I believe that's an American beech tree over here. And with many fine little twigs. And then here's the ash with these big fat fingers. It's opposite branched, which just means that here's a branch and then twigs come up opposite one another across the branch. And the end of the branches look like a bird's foot. So they have the perfect, here's, one little claw, another little claw, and here the front claw of like a chicken foot or something like that. And those just really fat fingers. Moving on here, American beech. So American beech, I learned as having very smooth skin like very smooth bark like elephant skin. So it's the only tree species that we have that the bark should be completely smooth. And it's this beautiful, smooth, gray bark. Sometimes you can see like initials that have been carved in it from like 30 years ago, and they're still legible, which is pretty amazing. Unfortunately, it's also afflicted with an invasive disease that was introduced in the early 1900s called beech bark disease. So while you'll still see patches of smooth bark, a lot of times that smooth bark will have these black pockmarks or cracks in it, which is a symptom of that beech bark disease. Here's another example of a bud. So again, right now you won't be able to tell these buds, but later by the end of the summer, they'll be fully formed buds like this. I always learned this bud, which is longer and thinner and pointier than any other bud that you're gonna see, looks like a cigar that a mouse would smoke. You see that? Even with like, it looks like this perfect little cigar for a mouse. And again, it's longer and thinner and pointier than any other bud you're gonna see, so that can be a really good characteristic for identifying beech, even when they're young. Beech also has a distinctive leaf trait, which is that, so here's the leaf, and we talked about veins on a leaf. Basically, this is just like a center vein, and these are just some side veins or lateral veins. If you follow these lateral veins to the margin of the leaf on beech, each vein ends in a single tooth. So at the end of each vein, there's just this little out-jutting tooth right here. And there's a lot of different tree species that have serrations, like all these tons of teeth or a jagged looking leaf margin. But beech is the only one where each vein ends in one tooth. They also have these really cool spiky beech nuts, which bears really like, and turkeys and deer and everything. That's what they look like when they break apart, and there'll be 2 or 3 beech nuts in there. And sometimes you'll see beech trees that have bear claw marks. So that's a tree that's a beloved bear tree. And that's just, all those little scrapes are just marks from the bear's claws as they climb up these trees. Bears really like beech trees, and they'll actually go back to the same beech tree year after year after year and visit it and teach their young to climb on these same beech trees. And so you can walk through the woods, and sometimes there's no bear claw marks in any beech trees, and then you'll just find one that's just covered in them. It's just sort of just an important bear beech tree. And in the wintertime, young beech will hold on to their leaves, and they'll get dry, and they'll rattle around. And so you'll be able to see them because it'll be the only tree in the understory of the forest which will have all hanging on to all these leaves, and then you'll hear that dry rattling sound. So with that, I think I'm going to skip red oak for now, and just let you know some of my favorite identification books. There's this book, A Beginner's Guide to Recognizing Trees of the Northeast by Mark Michaelis, which is really great. I also really like the book Bark, A Field Guide to Trees of the Northeast by Michael Wotek. And with that, here's some upcoming events that the Vermont Land Trust is putting on. Wildflowers in the Woods on the 19th, Exploring Wetlands from Lakeshore to Summit on the 20th, Restoring Vanished Landscapes on the 3rd, and on the 12th, Among Grassland Habitats. And you can visit the Vermont Land Trust website at vlt.org to learn more.